What if the most important words ever written were penned over 2,500 years ago, and most people have never truly read them? A single chapter, 52 verses. And hidden inside those ancient lines is the answer to the one question every human being has ever asked. Why does God allow suffering? Daniel Whitmore had been a pastor for 40 years. He had held the hands of dying men. He had stood beside open graves in February rain without an umbrella. Not because he forgot it, but because he felt it was wrong to stay dry when the family beside him was soaking in grief. He had baptized babies who would later bury their own parents. He had counseled marriages that survived and marriages that didn't. He had seen faith born and faith destroyed in the same living room, sometimes on the same afternoon. He had read the Bible more times than he could count. But on the last Tuesday evening of his 40-year ministry, Daniel Whitmore sat alone in the fellowship hall of Bethel Community Church in rural Tennessee, and he held the book open to a passage he had returned to more than any other, and his hands were trembling, not because he was old, not because the room was cold, but because after 40 years the words still hit him like the first time. Isaiah 53. He pressed his palm flat against the page and closed his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, "help them hear what you showed me." The fellowship hall filled slowly that evening. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen counter at the back. Women in their 60s and 70s settled in with their well-worn Bibles, some of those Bibles so old that pages had been taped back in along the spine. Men who worked with their hands sat in the back row, arms crossed, not out of resistance, but out of habit. That's how men like them were raised to sit. And then there was Michael Carter. He came in late. He always came in late. He stood near the door for a moment as if deciding whether to stay, and then he took the chair closest to the exit. Daniel noticed him. Daniel always noticed him. Michael was 34 years old. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and lately he was carrying something in his expression that Daniel recognized immediately, because Daniel had seen it in his own mirror once 30 years ago, in the worst season of his life. It was the look of a man who had stopped expecting anything good. Michael's father, Robert Carter, had died 8 months earlier. Lung cancer. 56 years old. 3 weeks from the diagnosis to the funeral. Michael had barely had time to get home from Atlanta before his father was gone. And when he stood at that graveside, something inside him didn't just grieve. It turned. He hadn't been back to church since the funeral. Until tonight. Nobody in the room knew what had convinced him to come. Not even Michael himself. Daniel opened without announcement. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask people how their week was. He didn't open in prayer, which surprised everyone, because Daniel Whitmore always opened in prayer. Instead, he looked around the room slowly, and he asked a question. "Who here," he said, "has ever felt like they were carrying something that wasn't their fault, but it cost them everything anyway?" Silence. Then Margaret Hollis, 71 years old, mother of 4, grandmother of 9, raised her hand, halfway, like she wasn't sure she had permission. Then Earl Dawson raised his, a farmer, 68, a man who hadn't spoken in church in 15 years. Then slowly, almost invisibly, Michael Carter lifted one finger from his knee, just one finger. Daniel nodded. "That," he said quietly, "is where Isaiah 53 begins." Tata. I didn't turn to Isaiah 53 immediately. That was the first unexpected thing. Instead, Daniel asked them to picture the world without God, not without religion, without God. A world where there is no one watching, no one measuring, no one who cares about the widow or the orphan, or the man who lies awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if his life amounted to anything. In that world, Daniel said, suffering is just biology, pain is just chemistry, death is just physics. Nothing means anything, because nothing was ever meant to mean anything. He paused. Now tell me, is that the world any of you believe you live in? Nobody answered, but the room shifted. You could feel it. Because if God exists, Daniel continued, then suffering cannot be random. It must mean something. And if it means something, then the most important question in the entire Bible is not, does God exist? The most important question is, what does God do with human suffering? He finally picked up his Bible. Isaiah 53 is God's answer. Tunk. Michael Carter was not taking notes. He was staring at the floor. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the last conversation they had in the hospital, the one where Robert Carter grabbed his son's arm with a grip that surprised Michael, because a dying man shouldn't be able to hold on that hard, and said, "Son, don't you let this make you bitter. You hear me? Don't." Michael had nodded, because that's what you do when your father is dying. But he had let it make him bitter. Not in dramatic, obvious ways. He didn't throw things or curse at the sky. His bitterness was quiet. It was the kind that makes a man stop calling his mother back, stop going to church, stop believing that anything or anyone was watching out for him. Because if God was watching, why didn't he do something? Michael had carried that question for 8 months like a stone in his chest. And tonight, sitting in that folding chair nearest the exit, he hadn't come because he expected an answer. He had come because he was tired of carrying it alone. Yawn. Daniel began reading, not the whole chapter. He read one line. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He stopped. I want you to hear what that actually says, Daniel told them. It doesn't say he observed sorrow from a distance. It doesn't say he understood grief intellectually. It says he was acquainted with grief. That word acquainted in the Hebrew, it means known, familiar, close. He looked around the room. God became familiar with grief. Margaret Hollis pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Earl Dawson uncrossed his arms. Michael Carter finally looked up. And the text gets more specific, Daniel said. Because Isaiah isn't just describing someone who suffered. He's describing someone whose suffering had a purpose. Someone who walked into the worst thing imaginable, not by accident, and not because he had no choice, but because he chose it. He set the Bible down. And that, he said, is the mystery that changes everything. Why? Daniel Whitmore had a habit in his teaching. He would pause just before the most important point and look at his shoes. The congregation had learned over the years that when Daniel looked at his shoes, something significant was coming. He looked at his shoes. Then he raised his eyes and said something nobody in the room expected. The servant in Isaiah 53 was not merely a good man who died too young. The servant was not a symbol of national suffering or historical tragedy, and the servant was not simply a metaphor. He picked up the Bible again. Isaiah 53 is a prophecy, written 700 years before the events it describes. And it describes not just what would happen, but why. And the why is what most people never stop long enough to hear. He read the line that had haunted him since the first time he read it as a young seminary student. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He said it again, slower. He bore our griefs, he carried our sorrows. Not his own, Daniel said. Ours. The room was completely still. The innocent one, Daniel continued, carried what the guilty ones could not. And according to Isaiah, that was the plan. That was never an accident. That was never God losing control of history. He pressed the open Bible against his chest. That was love. Poing. Michael Carter felt something crack inside him. He couldn't explain it logically. He wasn't a man who talked about spiritual experiences. He worked in construction. He dealt in measurements and materials and problems that had concrete solutions. But something cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like the first fracture in a wall that has been under pressure for too long. His father had told him once, this was years ago before the illness, that the most dangerous prayers are the ones you pray when you've stopped believing anyone is listening. Because those prayers, Robert Carter had said, come from the very bottom of who you are. No performance, no pretense, just the raw truth of what you need. Michael hadn't prayed in 8 months, but sitting in that folding chair, staring at an old man holding a Bible against his chest like it was something precious. Michael Carter, without moving his lips, without making a sound, thought the most honest thing he had thought in nearly a year. If you're real, I need you to be what he's describing. He didn't know yet that the answer was already written. 700 years before Jesus was born, in a chapter called Isaiah 53, and Daniel Whitmore was only just beginning. Daniel didn't move from where he was standing. He let the silence sit. That was something he had learned early in ministry. Silence is not empty silence. When used correctly, is the loudest thing in any room. And right now, the silence in that fellowship hall was working on people. You could see it in the way Margaret Hollis had stopped fidgeting with her handkerchief. You could see it in the way Earl Dawson was leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees, like a man who hadn't leaned toward anything in a long time. And you could see it in Michael Carter, who had stopped staring at the floor and was now staring at Daniel with the expression of someone who had just heard his own name, called in a crowd, startled, uncertain, but listening. Daniel picked the Bible back up. I want to tell you something that most people never stop to consider, he said. Isaiah 53 was not written after the fact. It was not written by someone looking backward at history and trying to make sense of what had already happened. It was written approximately 700 years before the events it describes. He let that number land. 700 years. Think about what that means, Daniel said. 700 years before the crucifixion. 700 years before anyone had ever heard the name Jesus of Nazareth. An old prophet sits down and writes about a man who will be pierced, who will be silent before his accusers, who will be buried with the rich, who will be counted among criminals, who will be beaten beyond recognition, and through all of that bring healing to millions of people. He set the Bible back on the table. That is either the most stunning coincidence in the history of human literature, or it is God speaking. From the third row, a man named Gerald Pruitt, 63 years old, retired school teacher, a man who had spent his entire adult life asking questions before accepting answers, raised his hand. "Daniel," Gerald said, "with respect, couldn't someone have written Isaiah 53 after the fact to make the prophecy fit the event?" It was a fair question, the kind of question an honest man asks, and Daniel smiled because he had been waiting for it. "That," he said, "is exactly the right thing to ask." Talk. Daniel explained what most people in that room had never been taught. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in caves near the Dead Sea. Among those scrolls preserved in clay jars hidden for centuries was a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah. Scholars dated that manuscript to at least 100 years before Christ, possibly earlier, and Isaiah 53 was there. Word for word, every line, every detail about the suffering servant written before the birth of Jesus, confirmed by archaeology, sitting in a jar in a cave for 2,000 years, waiting to be found. Gerald Pruitt sat back in his chair. "Oh," he said quietly, "just oh. Sometimes. That's the only word available when something shifts the foundation under your feet." But Daniel wasn't finished, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were only the beginning of what he wanted them to understand. "Here is where it gets extraordinary," Daniel said, and his voice dropped lower, not because he was performing, but because what he was about to say still affected him after 40 years of knowing it. The early followers of Jesus, the first disciples, the people who walked with him, ate with him, watched him die. They were Jews, every single one of them. They knew the scriptures. They had grown up reading Isaiah. They had memorized the Psalms. They knew the law and the prophets the way you and I know the alphabet. He paused. And when Jesus was crucified, they were destroyed. Not just grieving, destroyed. Because in their understanding, a dead Messiah was a contradiction in terms. A Messiah who gets arrested and executed is not a Messiah. He's a failure. Michael Carter shifted in his chair. Something about the word failure caught in his chest. "Peter denied he even knew him," Daniel continued. "The disciples scattered. They locked themselves in a room because they were afraid. These were not men who were working on a conspiracy. These were men who had lost everything they believed in a single weekend." He picked the Bible up again, and then something happened that turned those broken, hiding, terrified men into people who walked out into the streets of Jerusalem and told everyone they saw that Jesus had risen from the dead, and not one of them under torture, under imprisonment, facing execution, not one of them ever recanted. Gerald Pruitt was no longer asking questions. He was listening like his life depended on it. "What happened in that locked room," Daniel said, "wasn't a strategy meeting. It was an encounter. And when those disciples finally opened Isaiah 53 after the resurrection, they didn't find coincidence. They found confirmation." He read the verses now slowly, one at a time, and he built the case like a man laying bricks, each one placed deliberately, each one supporting the next. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Daniel looked up. At his trial, the Roman governor Pilate was amazed. Scripture records that Jesus said almost nothing in his own defense. Pilate himself said, Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And Jesus gave him no answer, not one word. He read the next verse. "He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, crucified between two criminals," Daniel said. "Buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man." Written 700 years earlier, fulfilled on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem. He read again. "By his wounds we are healed." He stopped there. He didn't explain that one immediately. He let it sit. And in the silence that followed, Margaret Hollis let out a breath that wasn't quite a cry, but wasn't far from it either. Michael Carter pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. I was not a man who cried in public. He hadn't even cried at his father's funeral, not in front of anyone. He had waited until he was alone in the car in the parking lot of the funeral home, and then he had pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and made sounds he didn't know he was capable of making. He was close to that place again, right now, in a folding chair in rural Tennessee. Because what Daniel was building, brick by brick, verse by verse, wasn't just a theological argument. It was answering the question Michael had been living inside of for 8 months. Let me tell you what the people of Isaiah's time understood about sacrifice. Daniel said, shifting direction suddenly, and the shift was deliberate because he could feel the room reaching capacity, and he needed to give them solid ground before taking them deeper. In the ancient world, in the world of the Old Testament, blood sacrifice was not a primitive superstition. It was a statement about the nature of sin. It was a way of saying wrongdoing has weight. It costs something. Forgiveness isn't free because nothing of value is free. An animal was offered, innocent, without defect, and the one bringing the sacrifice placed their hands on the animal's head, symbolically transferring guilt, and the animal died in their place. It was brutal by modern standards, but it was honest. It was saying, Daniel told them that sin is not nothing, that broken trust, broken lives, broken people, these things carry a cost, and something has to bear that cost. He leaned on the table. The entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament, hundreds of years of it, was pointing toward a moment that hadn't happened yet. Every lamb that died on that altar was asking a question the Old Testament couldn't fully answer. What happens when the sacrifice isn't an animal? What happens when the one who offers himself is the Son of God? He tapped the open Bible. Isaiah 53 is the answer. Gerald Pruitt leaned over to the woman beside him, his wife Carol, and said under his breath, "I've been going to church for 40 years. Why didn't anyone ever teach it this way?" Carol didn't answer him. She was too busy listening. Then Daniel said something that no one saw coming. He closed the Bible entirely. He set it on the table. He clasped his hands together, and he said in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used all evening, "I need to tell you something personal." The room sharpened. 31 years ago, Daniel said, "I almost left the ministry." Nobody moved. I was 38 years old. I had been pastoring for 9 years. I had watched a young couple in this congregation lose their son, 18 months old, to a fever that shouldn't have been fatal. I had sat in their living room for hours, and I had nothing to say, because everything I had been trained to say felt like paper in my mouth. He looked down for a moment, I went home that night and I told my wife, Helen, that I didn't think I believed what I was preaching, not because I thought God wasn't real, but because I couldn't find any shape, any reason, any mercy in what had just happened to that family. The fellowship hall was not breathing. Helen didn't try to argue me out of it. She just went and got my Bible, and she opened it to Isaiah 53, and she put it in my hands, and she said, "Read it again. But this time, don't read it as theology. Read it as a story. Read it as something that actually happened to someone who actually existed." He picked the Bible up from the table, and I read it. And for the first time in 9 years of ministry, I wept. He looked up, because I finally understood what Isaiah was saying. God did not watch his servant suffer from a comfortable distance. God entered the suffering. God became acquainted with grief personally, physically, in a human body on a Roman cross, so that when you and I sit in our worst moments and wonder if anyone in the universe understands what we are going through, the answer according to Isaiah 53 is yes. Someone does. Someone who chose to. Michael Carter had stopped pressing on the bridge of his nose. He was staring at Daniel with something raw and undefended in his face. And Daniel, looking at him across the room, said nothing else for a long moment. He simply looked back. Because some truths don't need commentary. They need space. They need the silence in which a man sitting in a folding chair nearest the exit can finally honestly begin to let the wall come down. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. And then Michael Carter did something that surprised even himself. He spoke. Not loudly, not with any particular confidence. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been holding something underwater for so long that his arms finally give out and it breaks the surface on its own. "Pastor Daniel," he said, "can I ask you something?" Every head in the room turned, because Michael Carter had never spoken in a Bible study. Not once. In the months before his father died, he had attended maybe 4 or 5 times, always at Robert Carter's quiet insistence, and he had always sat in the back and said nothing. He was known in that congregation mostly by association Robert's boy, the one who moved to Atlanta, the one who came home for the funeral and never quite left. Daniel looked at him directly. "Go ahead, son." Michael's jaw tightened at the word son, not in anger, in something closer to the opposite of anger. "You said the disciples, after the crucifixion, they were hiding. They were terrified. They thought it was over." He stopped, cleared his throat. "That's how I've been feeling. For 8 months. Like it's over. Like whatever I believed before my dad died, it just doesn't hold together anymore." He paused again. "So, how did they get from that locked room to walking back out into the street? What actually changed for them?" The question landed in the center of the room like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He pulled his chair out from behind the table, turned it around, and sat down facing the congregation directly, the table now behind him like a man who was done with formalities. "That," Daniel said, "is the most important question of the entire evening." Cheong. I took them to the moment nobody talks about enough. Not the resurrection appearances, not the empty tomb, the moment between. Friday evening, Jesus is dead. His body has been taken down and placed in a borrowed tomb. The stone has been rolled into place. The disciples are scattered. Peter, the one Jesus called the Rock, the one who swore he would die before he denied his Lord. Peter has already denied him 3 times before sunrise. He is not hiding because he is cautious. He is hiding because he is ashamed, because he made a promise in front of witnesses and broke it within hours, and the man he made it to died before Peter could find a way to apologize. That is a specific kind of darkness, the kind that doesn't just grieve, the kind that condemns. Saturday, Daniel said, is the day the Gospels say almost nothing about. Friday has the crucifixion, Sunday has the resurrection. But Saturday, that in-between day, that is the day I think about most often, because Saturday is the day when everything is over and nothing has happened yet. Gerald Pruitt's wife, Carol, leaned forward in her chair. "That's where most of us live," she said quietly. She hadn't planned to say it out loud. It just came out. Daniel pointed at her. "Yes, exactly. Most of us spend our lives in Saturday. The wound has happened. The miracle hasn't come yet. And we genuinely do not know whether Sunday is real." He stood back up. He couldn't teach sitting down. He never could. "Now, here is what I want you to understand about the disciples on that Saturday. They did not open Isaiah 53. They should have. The clues were all there, but they were too devastated to think clearly. Grief does that to people. It narrows your vision until you can only see the walls of the room you're hiding in." He walked to the left side of the room, then back to the right, not pacing, thinking out loud with his whole body. But when Sunday came, when the tomb was empty, and the appearances started, the first thing the risen Jesus did with his disciples was open the scriptures. Luke 24 records it. He found them. He walked with 2 of them on the road to Emmaus. They didn't even recognize him, and he opened the scriptures and explained everything Moses and all the prophets had written about him, and their hearts burned within them as he spoke. He stopped walking, and the chapter at the center of everything he showed them was Isaiah 53. Chung. Michael was gripping the edge of his chair now. Not dramatically. The way a person grips something when they realize the ground underneath them is not what they thought it was. Daniel read the verse he had been building toward all evening. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. He read it again, slower. Then he did something unexpected. He closed the Bible and recited the next line. From memory, his eyes open, looking directly at the congregation. "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." He let every word settle. "Do you hear what that is saying?" he asked. "It is not saying that the servant suffered because he was weak. It is not saying that he suffered because God abandoned him. It is saying that the suffering was a transfer, a deliberate, chosen, purposeful transfer of guilt from the ones who deserved it to the one who didn't." Gerald Pruitt's hand went up. "But that doesn't seem fair." "No," Daniel said immediately. "It doesn't, and that's exactly the point." He leaned forward toward Gerald. "Grace is not fair. If it were fair, it wouldn't be grace. It would be justice. And justice for people like you and me, with the lives we've actually lived, and the things we've actually done. Justice is not what we want. We want mercy. We want someone to look at everything we are and everything we've failed to be and love us anyway." He straightened. Isaiah 53 says that someone did exactly that, not despite the suffering through it. Carol Pruitt was crying now. She wasn't trying to hide it. She was the kind of woman who had stopped being embarrassed by tears somewhere around age 60, because by 60 you realize that tears are honest and pretending not to feel things is exhausting. Chug. Then Daniel said the thing that nobody saw coming, the thing that made the entire room shift on its axis. "I need you to understand something about the Jewish rabbis," he said. "Something that most Christians have never been told." He had everyone's full attention. For centuries, the dominant interpretation among Jewish scholars was that Isaiah 53 was describing the nation of Israel. The suffering servant was the Jewish people, their collective pain, their exile, their persecution. That was the majority position. He let that sit for a moment. But here is what most people don't know. Before that interpretation became dominant in the earliest rabbinic writings in the Talmud itself, in texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries, there are Jewish scholars who interpreted Isaiah 53 as describing the Messiah. Personally, individually, a specific person who would come and suffer on behalf of others. Gerald Pruitt straightened in his chair. "Are you serious?" "I am completely serious," Daniel said. The Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin refers to the Messiah as one who bears the sicknesses of Israel. The great medieval rabbi Maimonides listed the suffering servant among the references to the Messianic age. And there are documents, ancient documents, where rabbis interpreted Isaiah 53 as describing a specific messianic figure who would be rejected and then vindicated. He pressed his point. The interpretation shifted away from the personal Messiah, reading largely because of the conflict with Christianity. Because if Isaiah 53 describes a personal Messiah who suffers and is vindicated, the question becomes unavoidable: who fits that description better than Jesus of Nazareth? The room was electric. Michael Carter had both feet flat on the floor now. He was no longer sitting near the door like a man ready to leave. He was sitting like a man who had realized almost too late that he was somewhere important. Daniel went back to the text. He always went back to the text. That was the discipline of 40 years, no matter how interesting the history, no matter how compelling the argument, the text was the anchor. He read, "He was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." Cut off from the land of the living, Daniel repeated. That phrase in Hebrew implies a death that was premature, violent, undeserved. And yet, look at the very next verse. After describing his death, after describing his burial, Isaiah writes, "He shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." He looked up. You cannot see your offspring after you are dead. You cannot prolong your days after you are buried. Unless... He stopped. The word hung in the air. Unless. Isaiah writes about the servant's death and the servant's life in the same breath, without explanation, without apology, as if it is simply obvious. As if the servant dying and then living again is not a contradiction that needs to be resolved, but a reality that needs to be declared. He closed the Bible one more time. The cross, Daniel said, looked like the end of the story to everyone watching. The disciples saw it as failure. The religious leaders saw it as victory. The Romans saw it as routine, but Isaiah 700 years earlier saw it as neither the end nor a failure. He walked back to the center of the room. Isaiah saw it as the moment the entire plan came together. Michael Carter made a sound, short, involuntary. The kind of sound a person makes when something hits them in a place they didn't know was still tender. Because he had been asking for 8 months why God had taken his father, and he had never once considered, not once, that the God he was angry at was the same God who had watched his own son die, and chose it for a reason, for his reason. Daniel looked at him across the room, and this time, when their eyes met, Michael didn't look away. And in that look passed something that had no name in any language, only in the space between a broken man and a truth that was old enough to have been waiting for him all along. Daniel poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the back table, not because he was thirsty, because he needed a moment, because what he was about to say next was the part that always cost him something every single time. He taught it. 40 years, and it still cost him. He had decided long ago that the day it stopped costing him something was the day he needed to stop teaching. He drank, set the cup down, turned back around. "I want to talk about guilt," he said. Nobody laughed. Nobody shifted uncomfortably, because everyone in that room above the age of 50 has lived long enough to know that guilt is not a small subject. Guilt is the water many people swim in every single day of their lives without ever giving it that name. Not guilt as a concept, Daniel continued. Guilt as a weight, as a physical thing that sits on your chest when you wake up at 2 in the morning and the house is quiet and there is nothing to distract you from yourself. He looked around the room slowly. Every person in this room is carrying something. I have been a pastor long enough to know that. You don't have to tell me what it is, but I know it's there, because that is the human condition. We accumulate. We make decisions we cannot undo. We say things we cannot unsay. We fail people we love. We fail ourselves. And then we carry it sometimes for decades because we don't know how to put it down. Margaret Hollis had her eyes closed. She wasn't sleeping. She was listening with her whole body. Isaiah 53 addresses that directly, Daniel said. Not around it, not gently, directly. He opened the Bible. He read, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." He looked up. That word iniquity in the Hebrew is the word avon. And avon doesn't just mean sin as an action. It means the guilt that comes from the sin, the consequence, the moral weight of it, the thing that follows you. He closed the Bible. God didn't just transfer the act, he transferred the weight. Michael Carter had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. He was not crying. He was thinking so hard it looked like pain. Because what Daniel was describing, the weight, the 2 in the morning silence, the thing that follows you, Michael knew that with a precision that required no explanation. His weight had a specific shape. The last real conversation he'd had with his father before the diagnosis. Not the hospital visit, not the phone calls after the last ordinary conversation, the kind you have when you think you have unlimited ordinary conversations left. Michael had been irritated. He had been distracted by work, by a project deadline, by something that mattered so much then and meant absolutely nothing now. and his father had called to just talk. The way Robert Carter always called with no agenda, just wanting to hear his son's voice. And Michael had kept the call short, 15 minutes, maybe less. I had said, "Dad, I gotta go. I'll call you this weekend." He hadn't called that weekend. 2 weeks later, Robert Carter was diagnosed with lung cancer. Michael had never said that out loud to anyone, not to his mother, not to the grief counselor his employer had offered after the funeral, not to the friends who checked on him in the weeks immediately following. He had carried it in the exact place Daniel was describing, the 2 in the morning place, and it sat there like a stone that had grown into the wall rather than something that could simply be removed. He didn't know that Daniel could see it on his face. I didn't know that half the people in that room were carrying something with the exact same shape, different details, same weight. Daniel set the Bible down again and folded his hands. "Let me tell you what Isaiah 53 is not saying," he said, "because this is where people get confused, and the confusion is costly." He had everyone's attention locked. It is not saying that the servant's suffering magically erases your past. It is not saying that pain disappears, or that consequences vanish, or that hard things stop being hard. The chapter doesn't promise you an easy life. Anyone who reads Isaiah 53 and walks away thinking God promised them comfort and ease, they didn't read it carefully enough. Gerald Pruitt nodded. He had been burned by that misreading before. He had watched people walk away from faith when the easy life didn't arrive on schedule, and he had always suspected the problem began with a wrong expectation. What Isaiah 53 is saying, Daniel continued, his voice gaining weight with every word, is that you do not have to carry the verdict alone. The guilt, the avon, the moral consequence of everything you have done and left undone, that weight was placed on the servant, deliberately, willingly, so that you would not have to be crushed by it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. The servant didn't take it from a distance. He came close enough to take it personally. Carol Pruitt reached over and took her husband's hand without looking at him. Gerald let her. He closed his fingers around hers and stared straight ahead. What? Then Daniel asked a question that nobody in the room expected. How many of you, he said, have ever tried to forgive yourself for something and failed? The silence that followed was the most honest silence of the entire evening, because that question doesn't require a raised hand to be answered. It answers itself in the way people's faces change when they hear it. The slight flinch, the jaw that tightens, the eyes that go somewhere private for just a moment before returning. Margaret Hollis opened her eyes. She had been a young mother once, 26 years old, and she had made a decision in a season of fear and financial desperation that she had never fully forgiven herself for. It was decades ago. She had built a life of faith and service and love, around the edges of it, trying to cover it the way you place furniture over a damaged floor. But the floor was still damaged, and some nights she still felt it give beneath her. She had never told anyone in that church, not even her closest friend. She didn't know that the woman sitting 3 chairs to her left was carrying something nearly identical. That's the cruelest trick guilt plays. It convinces you that your particular weight is uniquely disqualifying, that everyone else's burden is manageable, but yours is the one that God cannot cover. Yours is the exception. Daniel said, I Isaiah 53 destroys that lie at the root. He said it with a force that startled the room. It says all, not most, not the ones who deserve it, not the ones whose sins are small enough, all. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That word is not decorative, it is the entire point. The servant's work was not partial, it was complete, it was sufficient. And if it is sufficient, then the verdict over your life is not guilty. It is covered. Margaret Hollis pressed both hands flat over her mouth, because she had heard that word covered in church before. But tonight in this room, with Daniel reading from a chapter written 2,500 years ago, the word landed differently. It landed like something true rather than something hoped for. Michael raised his head from his hands. His eyes were red. He wasn't pretending they weren't. "Pastor Daniel," he said, and his voice was rough. "What do you do when the person you failed isn't here anymore to forgive you?" The room went absolutely still. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. When he answered, he did not rush. He did not reach for easy comfort. He did not quote another verse immediately, because Michael Carter did not need a verse right now. He needed a human being to sit inside the question with him for a moment before answering. "You're talking about your father," Daniel said. It was not a question. Michael nodded once. His jaw was working hard. Daniel walked toward him. Not all the way. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give Michael the space a man needs when he is holding himself together with everything he has. "Robert Carter," Daniel said slowly, "came to me 6 weeks before he died." Michael's eyes widened. "He sat in my office, and he talked about you for an hour and a half. He talked about how proud he was of you. He talked about how much he loved you. And then he asked me specifically to pray for you. Not for your health, not for your success. He prayed right there in my office that God would meet you in whatever dark place you ended up in after he was gone." Michael Carter's composure broke. Not partially, completely. The sound he made was the sound of 8 months of compressed grief, finally finding the exit it had been denied. It came from somewhere below. Language below theology, below argument. It came from the place in a man where he is still underneath everything, simply someone's son. Daniel put his hand on Michael's shoulder. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. What was happening in Michael Carter right now could not be improved by words. It could only be held. And so Daniel held it the way a pastor holds the things people have carried too long alone, with steadiness and without flinching. The room gave him that. Nobody looked away. Nobody pretended it wasn't happening, because they were all in their own ways watching something they recognized the moment a burden becomes too heavy to carry alone, and someone finally lets it go. After a long moment, Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand. He exhaled, long and slow. He looked at Daniel and said with a voice that was wrecked and quiet and more honest than anything he had said in months, "I don't know how to start over." Daniel squeezed his shoulder once and stepped back. "That," he said gently, "is exactly what the last verse of Isaiah 53 is about." He walked back to the table. He opened the Bible one more time, and he read the verse that most people never reach because they stop at the suffering and never get to what comes after it. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one my servant make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. He looked up. The servant does not end in death, Daniel said. The servant ends in satisfaction, in the fruit of what the suffering produced. And what did it produce? He looked at Michael directly. People like you, walking back into the light. That is what the servant's suffering was for. Not just forgiveness in the abstract. You specifically finding your way back. Michael said nothing, but he didn't look away. And for the first time in 8 months, the stone in his chest, the one that had grown into the wall, shifted. Not gone, not yet, but no longer immovable. Nobody moved to leave. That itself said something. It was past 9 o'clock. These were people in their 60s and 70s, people with early mornings, with medication schedules, with the kind of bodies that remind you every evening that rest is no longer optional. And not one of them reached for a coat or a purse or a car key, because something was happening in that room that none of them wanted to interrupt. Michael Carter had straightened in his chair. His face was still raw, still carrying the evidence of what had just broken open in him. But his eyes were clearer than they had been all evening. There is a specific kind of clarity that only comes after a person has stopped pretending. Like a room after a storm. Everything rearranged, nothing hidden anymore. Air that feels different because it finally moved. Daniel stood at the front with the Bible closed in his hands. He wasn't reading anymore. He was speaking from the place where 40 years of faith and loss and doubt and return had settled into something unshakable. Not loud, not performed, just true. Let me tell you what I believe Isaiah 53 is doing inside the larger story of Scripture, he said. Because this is what I meant at the beginning of the evening when I said, if you understand Isaiah 53, you understand the entire Bible. He held up the closed Bible. This book spans thousands of years, dozens of authors, multiple languages, wildly different genres, poetry, history, prophecy, letters, law. And yet it asks the same question from the first page to the last. He paused. How does a holy God forgive broken people without betraying his own justice? Gerald Pruitt said quietly, almost to himself, That's the question, isn't it? That is the only question, Daniel said. Every other question in theology is downstream from that one. And every answer the Bible attempts, every sacrifice, every covenant, every prophet, every psalm is moving toward the answer that Isaiah 53 gives with breathtaking clarity. He set the Bible on the table and pressed both palms flat against it. The answer is not a system. The answer is not a religion. The answer is not a set of rules designed to make broken people better. The answer is a person. A suffering servant who absorbs the full weight of human failure so that the full weight of divine love can reach us. Margaret Hollis raised her hand, slowly, like a student who is not sure her question belongs in the room but cannot keep it inside any longer. Daniel, she said, I have been in this church for 37 years. I have heard sermons about Jesus my whole life. I have heard about the cross my whole life. Her voice was steady but thin, like thread pulled almost to breaking. Why does it feel different tonight? Why does this feel like the first time I've actually heard it? Daniel looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for that exact question. "Because tonight," he said, "you heard it in the right order." She blinked. "Most people are taught the New Testament first," Daniel explained. "They're told Jesus died for their sins, and they're expected to receive that as good news before they understand why it is news at all. But without Isaiah 53, without the centuries of prophecy and sacrifice, and the entire architecture of the Old Testament pointing toward this moment, the cross is just a tragic execution. It means something to you emotionally, maybe, but you don't feel the full weight of it. You don't feel the full relief of it." He straightened. "But when you come to the cross through Isaiah 53, when you understand what the servant was carrying and why, and that it was planned before you were born, suddenly it is not just a story about Jesus. It is a story about you. It has your name written into it. It was arranged with you specifically in mind." Margaret Hollis pressed her hand to her chest. She was thinking about the decision she had carried for decades, the one that lived in the 2 in the morning place, the one she had built her life of service around, trying to compensate for never quite believing she had been truly released from. And something was happening to it right now in this room, in a way she could not entirely explain and did not want to examine too closely for fear it would dissolve. It was getting lighter. Tink. Daniel walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room for just a moment, long enough that Gerald Pruitt glanced at his wife with a look that said, "Is he okay?" And then Daniel turned back around and his expression had changed. Not broken, not undone, but moved, genuinely moved. The way a man looks when he is standing inside something that is larger than himself, and he knows it. "I want to tell you something about the ending of Isaiah 53, he said. "Because most people focus on the suffering verses. They focus on the piercing and the crushing and the rejection. And those verses matter enormously. But if you only read Isaiah 53 for the suffering, you have missed the point by exactly half." He picked the Bible up one final time. Isaiah ends the chapter not with a grave, not with defeat. He ends it with vindication, with fruit, with the servant seeing the results of what his suffering produced and being satisfied. He read it slowly, with the weight of every year of his ministry behind the words. "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors." He closed the Bible for the last time. The servant, Daniel said, does not end in the tomb. The servant ends as the victor, and the proof of his victory is not a parade or a crown or an army. The proof of his victory is every single person who has ever stopped running from God and came home. He looked at Michael Carter. Michael looked back at him. "That," Daniel said quietly, "is what your father prayed for. That is what he asked God to do. And here you are." The twist came from where nobody was looking. Michael stood up. Not dramatically. Not with a speech prepared. He stood up the way a man stands when his legs decide before his mind does, when the body knows something is right before the brain has finished its argument. He looked at Daniel and said, "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For every time I saw you in the grocery store after the funeral and crossed to the other aisle," Michael said. I knew you wanted to talk to me. I wasn't ready. I thought if I talked to you, I'd have to talk to God, and I was too angry for that." Daniel smiled the real smile, the kind that reaches a man's eyes, when he is not performing happiness but actually feeling it. "Michael Carter," he said, "the fact that you were angry at God is not a problem. You cannot be angry at someone you don't believe exists." Michael stood there for a second, turning that over. And then, despite everything, despite 8 months of grief and bitterness, and 2 in the morning guilt, he laughed. Short, surprised, involuntary. The laugh of a man who has just been caught by a truth he didn't see coming. Earl Dawson, who had not spoken once all evening, made a sound that might have been a laugh too. He covered it with a cough, but it wasn't a cough. Daniel moved to close the evening, but before he did, he turned to the whole room and said one final thing. The thing he had been carrying toward all night, the destination he had known from the beginning. The reason he had asked God to help them hear it before he even opened his mouth. Isaiah 53 is not ultimately about theological categories, he said. It is not ultimately about prophecy fulfillment, as extraordinary as that is. It is not ultimately about historical evidence, or Dead Sea Scrolls, or ancient manuscripts. He paused. It is about what God decided to do about you, personally, specifically, before you were born, before you had done anything to deserve it or fail to deserve it, before your best moment or your worst one, before the thing you are most proud of, and before the thing you carry at 2 in the morning. He let that land. God looked at human brokenness, all of it yours included, and his answer was not a rule you had to keep. It was not a performance standard you had to meet. His answer was a servant. His answer was someone willing to go all the way into the darkest place. Human experience offers rejection, suffering, death, and come out the other side, holding the key. He looked around the room one last time. Margaret Hollis, with her hands folded in her lap, and something lighter in her face than she had worn in 30 years. Gerald and Carol Pruitt, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, which was not how they had come in. Earl Dawson, with his arms no longer crossed, sitting forward, a man who had leaned away from things for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to lean toward them. And Michael Carter, standing red-eyed, carrying less than he had walked in with, which was everything. When you understand Isaiah 53, Daniel said, you understand why Genesis had to begin the way it did with a creation that was called good. You understand why the law was given to show us how far we had fallen from good. You understand why the prophets spoke to point us toward the one who would bridge the distance. You understand why the cross happened, not as a tragedy, not as a failure, but as the climax of a story God had been writing since the beginning. And you understand why the resurrection was not a surprise, because Isaiah had already told you. The servant would see his offspring. He would prolong his days. The plan would succeed. He spread his hands. The entire Bible is one story, one question, one answer. And if you understand Isaiah 53, you understand all three. He stepped back. And then he did something that surprised the whole room. He sat down, not at the table. He pulled a chair to the center of the room and sat down among them, among the folding chairs and the worn Bibles and the people who had come on a Tuesday evening carrying more than they showed and he bowed his head. And he prayed. Not long, not loud, not with the polished language of a man who had given thousands of public prayers. He prayed like a man sitting inside the truth he had just finished describing. Quietly, directly, with the familiarity of someone talking to a person he had known for 40 years and trusted completely. He prayed for Margaret, for Gerald and Carol, for Earl, for every person in that room carrying something at 2 in the morning. And he prayed for Michael Carter by name. He prayed that Robert Carter's prayer, the one spoken in a pastor's office 6 weeks before a father died, would be answered completely in full in the life of his son. When he finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the coffee maker clicking off in the kitchen. Then Michael Carter sat back down in his chair, not the chair by the door. He had at some point in the last hour moved 3 rows forward without noticing. He sat with the Bible. Daniel had given him at the start of the evening open in his lap to Isaiah 53. He read it again slowly, the way you read something the second time, when the first reading has already changed you. He read the line his father would have wanted him to find. By his wounds we are healed. And for the first time since the parking lot of the funeral home, Michael Carter did not feel alone inside his grief. Not because the grief was gone, but because someone had been there first, had walked through it before him, had left the path open. That is the promise of Isaiah 53. Not that suffering disappears, not that loss becomes painless, but that no darkness you will ever enter is a darkness God has not already broken open from the inside. The servant went all the way down so that no one who follows him has to go alone. 2,500 years ago, an old prophet sat down and wrote the answer to the question every human being has ever asked. And on a Tuesday evening, in rural Tennessee, in a fellowship hall, with bad lighting and folding chairs and lukewarm coffee, that answer finally found the person it had been waiting for. The God of the Bible does not stand at a safe distance from your suffering. He enters it. He carries it. He transforms it into the very thing through which healing reaches you. And the proof of that was written 7 centuries before it happened, preserved in a clay jar in a cave for 2,000 years, pulled into the light by archaeology, and delivered on this particular Tuesday evening into the chest of a broken man who came in sitting by the door and left standing in the middle of the room. That is Isaiah 53. That is the whole Bible. That is the answer that was always already written for you.